Hello, and welcome to the ALN 2020 Asset Leadership Forum, Restructuring America. I am Nick Kanoki, the Director of Technology for the Asset Leadership Network, and I'm very excited to be starting off today's event. This is the Restructuring Federal Facility Asset Management. And I would just like to say before we begin that if you are watching and you'd like to comment or ask a question, please write it in the chat and we will hopefully be able to get it at the end. Or if not, maybe we can respond to it in an email sometime in the future. And now without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Eric Brown, ALN Senior Fellow and DHS Director, Mobile Assets and Personal Property. Eric?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session and glad to have you here. First of all, it's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, former director of the Surface Logistics Center for the U.S. Coast Guard and currently the Executive Director for Asset and Logistics, Mr. Ken Burgess.
Thank you, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Ken Burgess, and I am the Executive Director for Assets and Logistics within the DHS, or Department of Homeland Security, Office of Readiness Support. A couple things before I get started. Thank you very much to the Asset Leadership Network for inviting me and my team to speak today. I really appreciate it. We got out assets and asset management within the DHS Chief Readiness Support Office, particularly within the Asset and Logistics branch. And I was also enticed when I saw an old clip when there were a lot of references to McSorley's Pub in New York City. And anybody likes McSorley's Pub, I'm very glad to talk to, and hopefully maybe we could have a meeting there in the future. But we do appreciate the opportunity. First up, could we go to the slides, please, David?
Yep, I've got just bringing the slides up now. Just want to make sure everybody can see these fine.
Okay. Next slide, if we could, David.
Sure.
All right, thanks, David. And the agenda, what I'd like to do is walk through, just kind of give you an overview of real property within Department of Homeland Security. Well, we'd like to make this a little interactive. I've got two members of our real property team at DHS, Greg Ewing, who's acting real property office chief, and David Packer, who you may be able to see, who is a realty specialist, and they have been active participants in leading this journey for us at DHS. So I'll be bringing them about slide 5 or 6. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, if you look at the mission of DHS, DHS, first of all, is the newest cabinet level department in the United States government. It was formed by combining, in roughly 2002, by combining 22 existing departments and agencies. And so I work in the Chief Readiness Support Office for Tom Shalecki, who I think has spoken here at Asset Leadership Network a couple times. But we work for the Undersecretary of Management, Tex Als, and then we have the Chief Readiness Support Office, and I work for Tom, again, as an Executive Director for Assets and Logistics. We're responsible for asset management and real property, logistics integration, personal property, think Eric Brown, aircraft, including small UAS, 50,000 motor vehicles, 60% of them law enforcement vehicles, again, think Eric Brown, and boats. But we're here today to talk primarily about real property, but we're open to questions on any of our portfolio with DHS. Next slide, please. When you look at our portfolio at DHS, I think a couple of things stand out. It is large. We have over 50,000 individual real property assets, and that's a spread of over 100 million square feet total. So if you look at the left-hand part of the slide as well, if you go down the bottom, you see annual spend. We estimate that the components DHS-wide spend roughly $8 billion annually on real property. I have a financial management background, and that I guess in financial management, that's a very material figure. So when we look as to where we're focused on with real property, why we're focused on real property, One, it is a very large, it's a material amount of the budget of the entire DHS budget annually, and so it's a good place for efficiencies. Our motto is affordable readiness. Affordable readiness, where and the definition of affordable readiness is balance between operational effectiveness and dollar efficiency in meeting mission requirement. And what better way to focus affordable readiness than on an $8 billion real property portfolio? I think another thing of interest, if you go to the lower right-hand portion of the slide, sometimes with real property, you think, well, that's, we're talking office space. I don't know if we're totally unique across the government, but we certainly have a lot more than just office space that we manage. If when you look at law enforcement, specialized and border inspection stations, roughly 20% of our portfolio. We've got some unique requirements, Coast Guard family housing for active duty members. And even our warehouses in DHS really aren't warehouses. I'll call them they're operational support entities. We're talking about active distribution centers in FEMA. And the Coast Guard has inventory control points that are actively pushing spare parts for their aircraft and cutters around the world. Next slide, please. When you look at the structure of DHS, again, a large amount of components. I'll just go through some of the what I'll call the major components, some of the larger components. CBP, or Customers and Border Protection. If you look underneath the CRSO Office of Real Property tag there, FEMA, ICE, TSA, Coast Guard, and Secret Service. Each of those entities have been around a long time. They've got their own history. They're very proud of their history. They have their own mission. They're all governed by different congressional committees. They have unique funding authorities, unique funding, and unique IT systems. So our challenge is, when you look at that $8 billion portfolio and you reach across these 22 agencies and 12 with real property authority, and all using unique systems, unique funding strategies, how do you get around it from real property? How do you create efficiencies in the $8 billion? How do you even track the $8 billion? It has been our challenge, and we've been at it for a while. And if we go to the next slide, please. Greg Ewing, are you with us?
I'm here, Ken.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Greg Ewing and to talk about some of the challenges we faced. And Greg, if you can start off, you've been at this a few years. You've done some great work externally with other agencies, with OMB. What do you think is the biggest challenge you faced?
Well, like you said, Ken, you hit the nail on the head. We have a large volume of components, very, very diverse. We have diverse mission sets, anywhere from guarding the border, respond to disasters, to law enforcement. But each organization, each component that we're trying to oversee has, and you said history, but it isn't just history, it's the development of their systems and processes that are unique to that specific component. Each one has their own funding streams. So we don't control the budget. Each individual component controls a budget. So our influence it's difficult for the influence that way. Not just in the budget, but some of them have their own congressional committees to put that money through. So it makes it very difficult. So how do we get to demonstrate that strategic mission alignment? But the biggest challenge that we've been trying to come up with is, how do we get a handle on that? You threw out that 8 billion number. That's probably a good estimate, but still we don't have a good solid, what do we spend on real property? And specifically being able to link up how much from a planning through to budgeting, to execution, and then the execution. And how do we track those dollars and how do we get a handle on that? This is something that I've been working on. David's been working on me for about 3-4 years now. How do we get a handle on that and identify that gap? We also run the trouble with the varying levels of planning capabilities. Some components have very good systems in place and processes. We can go out and ask for their capital investment plan. They'll show us where they're at. Other components, not so much. Real an afterthought. And so how to pull that together. And then the quality, the data quality. Again, I can't stress this enough, the multiple IT systems. We're talking about different platforms, different formats, data that they're collecting. So it's very difficult. How do we pull that together so that we can get a solid comparison across components? And then, like I said, I already mentioned the wide range of funding streams, but this is something that we've been working on. We're also working with OMB and GSA and some other folks in the Federal Property Council on how do we get a handle on these costs. And what we're finding isn't just a DHS problem. Other agencies are experiencing the same thing and try to get a handle on those real property costs.
Could you talk expand on that just a little bit about the object class work you're doing with OMB, where you're at?
Yeah, one of the things we do, we put together a working group to take a look at the budget object classifications. If you're familiar with OMB A11, they have a standard structure for the budget object classifications. However, there's nothing in there specifically for real property. They have it broken down. There's major categories for personnel costs, for contracting costs, for investments, but real property spans across that. So being able to get a handle on real property costs is very difficult. In fact, most real property ends up being buried in these different codes. So what we're working on is, this is a work group project. This is multi-agency, us, I know Veterans Administration, Department of Transportation, some other folks are very interested in working with us to set up a standard budget object classifications for real property. So that when people do their planning, when they submit their budgets to OMB, that real property will be identified as a separate budget exhibit. So we get a real handle on exactly how much our real property spend is. We've gone ahead and identified cost pools all the way across the spectrum, from investment to sustainment to disposal. And then we have those categories set up. Now what we're doing is we've been kind of doing the tour around the different agencies, trying to generate some grassroots support for this effort. From our perspective, most of the agencies are very receptive to this. They see the need for this. They understand that gaining that visibility into the more transparency and visibility we have into how we're spending our money is important. The problem is, though, making those changes to A11. This is just those categories are pretty ingrained over the past, I think, 30 years. So that's the change we're working on right now. And like I said, it's one of the areas that DHS is leading, along with capital planning and workspace standards and things like that.
All right, thanks, Greg. And so you hit the challenges very well, and hit, I think, one area where we made a lot of progress. Not there yet, but certainly have a plan in front of OMB that's going to help us get our on a real property dollar figure, if nothing else.
Yeah, not just us, but other agencies across the board.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, so go to the next slide, please. Okay, now I'd like to introduce David Packerar. Again, he works in real property for assets and logistics within DHS. Works for Greg and I, and he has really been a stalwart in moving us forward with many initiatives across DHS. Again, trying to get our arms around this $8 billion portfolio in real property, with moving towards affordable readiness. But please go ahead, David.
Great, thanks a lot, Ken. So like Ken was saying, and Greg was saying, there's a lot of challenges, obviously, in terms of the scope of what we're looking at. What we have found in terms of actually moving forward and making progress is really just building on what foundations were already put in the past and making incremental improvements. So we've made significant improvements in this current year, but it's really built on largely what was done primarily in FY17. So like Ken was saying, our office is largely a policy office, and we the one big piece of movement that we made to make progress here in 2017 was the issuance of policy on requirements for doing strategic capital planning. That's really kind of the foundation that we built off of. Once we've got that policy in place, since 2017, we've been doing financial assessments, going out to the components. We've got a DHS real property budget exhibit, as well as a projects exhibit that captures what the spend is broken down into those categorizations that Greg had identified. We've been working and really leveraging that to get our better understanding of what our needs are and what gaps are. We've also been working extensively with OMB, as Greg was mentioning, working with that BOAC group, that working group. We've also been working with OMB also on the capital planning group. So OMB issued the M2003 memo, and what you'll notice in that M2003 memo is that aligns very closely with this policy that was issued in 2017. So it was largely based off that policy that we were put out there. Then also towards the end of 2019, with the identification and the release of that M2003, our leadership has made this capability a strategic priority. It's in the CRSO strategic plan to improve this capability. So with that leverage, we were able this year to make really extraordinary progress within the period of a year. So we initiated a program that essentially formalized the improvement of this capability, partnering across different lines of business, across all the components with legal interest authorities, as Ken had indicated earlier. Understanding what the scope of the existing federal requirements are, what our existing capabilities are, come up with a way to look to implement the improvements, look at the financials, spend a lot of time looking at public data, looking at internal data, looking at the results, the financial assessments. And what we've put together was a DHS Real Property Asset Management System manual. This is kind of really our key to success for 2020, along with the actual DHS Real Property Capital Plan. So on the actual system manual, this system manual was put together to meet the requirements of OMB's M2003, which has requirements there for improving policy. The development of it was taken based off of recommendations from GAO. So you obviously are, well, I'm sure a lot here are familiar with GAO's report on asset management and the recommendations there. And the foundation and the framework for this manual were put together using ISO 55000 as a framework to tie together the strategic plan to leadership, to actual operations, to measuring the performance, to improvements, to going back to the context. So that's the framework that we had put together. So we've been able to make lots of progress to move this forward. It's obviously not going to be an easy lift, but thankfully we've with the support of leadership, with our leadership here, we've been able to make that support. And the last thing I'll note on the success for 2020, we had mentioned partnering with components and other CXOs. We've been spending a lot of time partnering with our CFO office. They've really been crucial, and it's obviously a requirement of M2003 to have that partnership. But that has been very much a key to our success, is that partnership with the CFO. Moving on to 2021, we've got the framework in place. We've got that put together. What we're focusing on now is actually launching that. So there are strategic priorities, again, to move this forward as part of the Secretary's guidance. There's a requirement to identify real property spend in the next PPPE cycle, so the cycle for 23 through 27. And we are facilitating meeting that requirement through the framework that we had just talked. We're also working on actually formalizing this and revising the policy. So what we put together so far is currently in draft and is being finalized. We're working with our components to collect those feedback and responses in terms of improving what we have drafted, and we're looking to formally make that policy. Then we're looking to leverage our PMRs, the program management reviews, to improve the results as part of the improvement process. And again, I mentioned that planning for the next cycle. Again, the next cycle is 23 to 27. So we're working that in partnership with CFO. Data, that's obviously another big area. Greg touched on that, and that's it's a challenge, and there's really lots of improvement that I think is required there, and then your typical change management and communication that we need. So that's really what we're focusing on for 2021. Then I will go ahead and touch on lessons learned, and then I'll hand it over to back to Ken. In terms of lessons learned, what we've found is, I mean, really my top lessons learned is really the leadership buy-in and actually their support. That has really been key. This has been a priority for Ken and Tom. And because of that identification of this as a strategic priority, we've been able to have success. So that is a key lessons learned. Change management is always a challenge. And again, given the structure that we have, that's something that is always, you have to come into any kind of change like this with a change management thought in, and make sure you apply those policies. Other things that I'll note over here is make sure that, you know, we're partnering. What we really try and focus on is transparency with all the stakeholders, with our components, with different stakeholders within our office, within CFO, but a transparency on what we're doing, where we're going, why we're doing it, and make sure that we continuously have that loop, and everybody feels that they have a say in the direction that we're going. There's obviously best practices out there that, you know, I know we are focusing on: GAO, OMB, ISO, etc. And then the last thing I'll note over here is just the data. There's, you know, so much data that's out there. One area that we've been able to use, you know, Greg had mentioned that A11 section 83, it's got the budget object classes over there. It's not, you know, it's not perfect in terms of the identification of the spend relative to the life cycle of real property. However, there are some sections there that are specifically for real property that, you know, you've got the 32.0 that shows improvement to land and structures and others. So that's all public information. You just log on to USA Spend and download it. So we've been able to use that, obviously, on top of the internal data that we have as well. So that's I think I'll just leave it here. Ken, I'll pass it over back to you.
Okay, thanks, David. And it just, David hit the nail on the head. Change management is real hard, and it's a journey. We think it's very much worth the journey in real property. But I guess in my world, you know, you've got the crisis of the day. We in the asset and logistics shop are managing distribution of $178.3 million in CARE Act funding for PPE throughout the department. We've got a lot going on, a lot of risk with the burgeoning a small UAS, large UAS, unaccompanied aircraft system industry, and the threat, you know, the counter threats, the threats that it could be for law enforcement agencies. But Tom Shalecki, who is our boss, always comes back to what's going on with real property. And you know, I can't emphasize that enough. We're on the cusp of really doing some, I think, outstanding things and get our arms around real property. But it does take 100% commitment and drive and high cover to get where you need to go. And we're fortunate we've had that with Tom Shalecki, and we're going to keep moving forward. But I think that I've been involved with the Coast Guard with several change management in my previous career with change management, and it all starts at the top. So we can, any questions at all, or do we want to wait, or I could turn it over to Eric Brown?
Yeah, well, Ken, believe it or not, I have questions that have popped up while you're talking. So one of them is from Scott Mason, and one of the best practices, one of the best practices of the ISO 55000 training is to begin implementation with smaller manageable chunks. How do you see the promulgation or requirement on component agencies of the DHSRP asset management system manual, since it appears to be all-encompassing in terms of the requirements?
Well, I'll let David, and throughout this journey, we started in 2017, and a manual can be all-encompassing, but the fact of the matter is, what we look for is progress. And for instance, we're getting ready to include real property budget exhibits into its 2023 departmental budget. We've been at it we've been at this now actually 3 or 4 years before we made that decision. We were ready to go. So I think certainly the good news that you get a instruction out there or a manual is it gives someone a foundation, it gives someone a roadmap to success, and then I guess it's our job. It is our job within the department to prioritize where we want to make the most success and make sure the components aren't just going crazy trying to meet everything. But that's a very good question. I do know, for instance, in the Coast Guard, when we modernized logistics and engineering across the surface communities, surface being cutters and boats, and I was at that journey for 10 years. We didn't start with polar icebreakers or national security cutters. We started with the smallest boats we could. So you're right in that what you want to do is start small, have success, and build out. And so we're going to try to combine that with a template that we have with the asset management.
Yeah, and Ken, if I can add on to that, I think that's a great question, a great comment. But the reality is that what we have put together there in a manual, it's not necessarily revolutionary to our current policy. There's lots of different management systems out there, and our existing policies that we've had in place does not. I wouldn't say that the revision to the instruction, the 2520401, is going to be a night and day thing. We have been building on successes that we've had in the past and on processes that we have in the past. The existing policy has been out there since 2017. We've had a lot of success in terms of getting better understanding of what the spend is. The process overall is based on our overall funding process when it comes to the PPPE process. That is something that's been out there for years. So it's not a night and day thing. We have been working on building off of what we're doing. And again, the reality is once this policy goes out there and the manual goes out, it's not going to be a switch. It's really a change management process. Every component has different levels of maturity, different capabilities, different challenges, different data sets. And what Tom always says is we often can't control the velocity on where we go. We can control the direction. And that has been communicated to me as a leadership priority of we're focusing on a direction, getting movement towards that direction, towards improvement. And we, obviously are trying to move forward as quickly as possible. It's going to take some time.
Well, I do have another question for Ken and team from Ms. Cecilia Mowat. Given the diverse and segmented nature of your stakeholders, how much do you share the fundamentals of ISO 55000 and 55001 with those stakeholders to get a common understanding of the taxonomy? She said she loved the idea that budget process is heading in that direction to capture the information.
You want to give a shot at that one, David?
Sure. So yeah, the structure that's there is that's really key. So understanding what the life cycle cost is of the program, that's really key to understanding what the needs are, what the actual spend is, and the gap between, in terms of what your gap is on the financial side, association with risk. So having that structure there is really key. The work that Greg has been doing with OMB in terms of getting that structure improved from what's there in section 83 of A11, OMB Circular 11, that is really key. What I would say is that since about 2017, we have been having our budget exhibits to all components already in that structure, essentially showing the life cycle of the invest / acquire, going into sustain, going into disposal, and then overhead. So that's pretty much been the breakdown, and then a subsection between owned and leased. So we have had that, and we're working to improve that. So the work that Greg has been doing with OMB is really crucial to getting that structure across the board. What again I will say is that, you know, for other groups that may be looking to improve on this capability, the existing structure, there is some foundation there. Again, you know, you look at what's there in terms of 32.0 on improvements to land and structures, 25.4, 23.1, 23.2. There are, you know, a good amount of structure there. It's not exactly what we're looking for. It doesn't actually match our budget exhibit. However, there is a foundation to go off of, and I think that's really key. Looking at where we are right now in terms of existing capability, and then making adjustments to get that forward momentum.
And like David, that existing structure is there, and that gets us so far to a certain point because we can find those real property costs. But again, it's very difficult, as you know. We've been at this for a couple of years now. How we go ahead and dig through and pull that out, and is this really real property costs? How come it was over there? And like you said, the key that really unlocks this is we get those budget object classifications embedded into A11. So now what that does, that embeds it into our budgeting and our execution systems. So it becomes embedded in there. So then it's just a matter of rolling up those costs as we need to pull that out.
Absolutely, yeah. Data quality is always a challenge. You can have the structure there, but if crap and it's you know routine.
Oh yeah.
So I see no more questions in the chat or in the Q&A. Are there any questions that you guys see, Nick or Mike?
Hey, Eric, this is Keith. Can I ask a question?
Go right ahead, sir.
Hey, Ken, nice presentation and from you and your team. My question is kind of about the current situation. We're all kind of sitting at home, kind of looks that way. I was wondering if the higher ups were asking you to think about when the pandemic is over, are there going to be lasting changes as to how DHS uses real property moving forward? And
Yeah.
are you thinking about those now?
Yeah, and Tom had one session. We have a second session next week with across the components with their chief admin officers. But I mean, if you look at you know, we talk about square footage, and everything is really based on the number of people in the seats, you know, and the square footage. And now that's really going to, you know, that could significantly change because you really don't want people restricted, for instance, you know, if this is going to continue on. Also, you look at, for our office, for instance, we are in the middle of DC, and we've been telecommuting. I started work at DHS April 13th of this year, and I have gone to the office one day. And one of the reasons for that, and I know people are in different telecommuting phases, but the vast majority of our folks either take the subway or take the bus, you know, take mass transportation. So perhaps something where being in a urban market has been lucrative in the past because of the transportation. If those transportation modes are now, you know, hopefully it'll change a little bit, but maybe higher risk in the future. And you got to, so it's really a broad base of things that have to be considered. So.
Thanks.
So if there are no more questions from any panel members, first of all, Ken, I'd like to thank you and your team for doing the presentation today. And we really appreciate your time and expertise. David and Greg, outstanding. Thank you, sir.
Our pleasure, Eric. Thank you.
Anytime, Eric.
Outstanding. So with that, of course, you guys can leave if you'd like. I have to go ahead and proceed. I will turn this over to Mr. Keith Cunningham of the GAO, who spent 22 years focusing on federal real property management and telecommunications issues. Thank you there, Keith.
Thanks, Ken. It's almost 23 years, if you can believe that. Okay, so thanks for having me. I don't know how long ALN has been doing these annual forums, but however many number that is, that's how many I've participated in. I am a founding attender of these and love them every year. I just have a few things that I'm going to do today. I'm going to share my screen, if fingers crossed. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to do something a little different. First of all, I'm going to look at my building, which I miss very much. I've also only been to my building once in the last 7 months. I'm going to talk a little bit about current issues in federal facilities. I've talked a lot about the reports we've done recently, and maybe you've heard me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we see happening in real property right now and what we're thinking about it. Most of this comes from our high risk series. This is a report. This is kind of one of our signature reports that comes out every 2 years. People should get a physical checkup every year, but we give the federal government a physical checkup every 2 years. Our high risk report is the 30 odd some issues in the federal government that are at the highest risk for fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement. And since 2003, federal real property management has been on that list. That's almost since the beginning. We focus on 4 big issues, and I'm going to talk about what's happening currently in those issues. First one is excess and underutilized property. Long-standing issue. The federal government has more property than it needs. A couple things that we're looking at. RTF stands for reduce the footprint. This goes back to the Obama administration. In 2015, the goal was to freeze the footprint and then every year after that reduce the footprint. And it's been 5 years, and that's about how long it was supposed to be. So as you can look at my graphic here, the first year really good, and then each year since then not so good. And so we're looking at 2019, and I'm concerned that this trend will continue, and the focus on getting rid of excess and underutilized property has it's fallen into the background. Another thing that's new since our last report is the Public Buildings Reform Board. The Federal Asset Sale and Transfer Act of 2016 created a board, which then sat around for over a year until at least some of the members had been appointed by President and Congress. It did get constituted. They created a list of a dozen or so high value properties approved by OMB, and those properties are currently being disposed of. Those could get the government up to $500 million in revenue that then the board could use or is supposed to use for future rounds of facility reductions. So between reduce the footprint and it's now handing over to the Public Buildings Reform Board, how this board does will be critical to this issue with GAO moving forward. Probably the number one thing in excess and underutilized property. Next up is issues in leasing. So since the beginning, GAO has found that the federal government relies far more on leasing than it should. We're talking about large, stable space needs that would be better served if they were owned, particularly from a cost standpoint. I'll have an example of that in a second. So since 2019, a couple of big developments have occurred. The first one is the picture of the Department of Transportation headquarters building. This was the poster child of poor real property management. We leased it for more than a dozen years and then bought it at market price. This building, I don't know if you're in the DC area, you know this very well if you go to Washington Nationals ball games or DC United soccer games, because it's right in that area. When the federal government started leasing it, none of those things were there. It was kind of a rundown part of the city. So if we just bought it then, we could have bought the land, we already had the land, and built the property for under $300 million. And now we've spent over $2 billion renting and purchasing it. You can see why leasing isn't always the best strategy. Another thing is GSA has started under Dave Matthews, the Public Buildings Commissioner, has started a lease cost avoidance plan. And his plan is to save $4.7 billion in a number of strategies, shrinking the footprint of leases, moving leases from leased to owned properties, consolidating leases, and negotiating longer deals, which should be at a lower rate. We're looking at right now the first couple of years of implementation of that plan to see if those savings are actually being materialized. Our third of four issues that we always look at is data reliability. Our DHS friends talked about the need for good data to support decision making, and it's been a problem across the federal government since 2003. A couple things we're looking at this year. So we had a big report come out this year on the data, and the news was not good. One of the big things we found is just something as simple as the address of where buildings and structures are was very bad. We found over half of the addresses were either incomplete or incorrectly formatted, meaning they couldn't be read by a computer. So this is a big problem. This gives an example of one. Goddard Space Flight Center, anybody in the DC area probably visited. It has 215 buildings in it, and they are all located in the database as being just at Greenbelt Road. So Greenbelt Road is a 6.3 long road. It's very urban. And if you type that into Google or most computers, it'll just get you the center point, which is shown here on this map. And as you can see, it's over a mile from the main entrance. We asked NASA why they don't include a more specific address. And they said it was for security reasons. But the problem is if you type Goddard Space Flight Center into Google, you're going to find the exact address. And a map to the entire facility, actually. So it's not really a very good security if that's the reason. So what the federal government does to address the data reliability issues that we've found time and time again will help tell the tale of what we find for our 2021 report. The other big question related to the data is, what about DoD? As you can see here, DoD is the lion's share of real property holdings. So how their data goes is almost entirely how the federal government's data goes. And unfortunately, for the last several years, DoD's data has not been sufficiently reliable for OMB to use in its database or in tracking costs. So how DoD goes will also help us decide what we rate this in 2021. The last issue, which I didn't go over, was security. That's usually for a different audience. Security will come down to almost exclusively how the Federal Protective Service manages its contract guards. We found that the contract guards often don't have the right training to stand the post that they're standing, and DHS has been working on this for a long time, and they're finally rolling out a new training system and a new way of monitoring that the guards have the right training. How that turns out will also determine how security turns out for the federal government. All the stuff I'm talking about will culminate in just a couple months in February 2021, when the pandemic is gone and we're all back at work. We're going to come out with our new high risk list, and at that time we'll determine whether federal property will remain on the list or whether all those issues that I just described will all be corrected and we'll remove it from the list. And I can't tell you for sure which it'll be, but most people could probably surmise. And with that, that's all I have to present. And Eric, I can send it back to you, or I can answer any questions.
Okay, there was one question that was asked, but I think we're going to wait to the end of the panel, to the end of the presentation, so that all of the panel members can be asked that question and get a proper response. So
Sounds
thank you very much, Keith. I really appreciate your time.
Affirmative.
And with that, I would like to introduce the Director of the Board of Federal Facilities Council of the National Academies of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine, Mr. Cameron Oskvig.
Thank you, and thanks, Keith. It's a great intro and a great overview on many great topics that are of interest to the Federal Facilities Council. I'm Cameron Oskvig. I'm the director of the Federal Facilities Council, and I'm going to do a little introduction about the Federal Facilities Council, the National Academies Board on Infrastructure, and then some about the FFC's interest in federal facilities asset management. The Federal Facilities Council is a cooperative association of federal agencies whose mission is to identify and advance technologies, process, and management practices to improve management, operations, and evaluations of federal facilities throughout their life cycle. It was established in 1953, and it includes over 20 federal agencies with a diverse set of missions and types of assets and asset classes. The FFC is chaired by a former Assistant Secretary, Jim Rispoli of the DOE, and is vice chaired by George Lee from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It has 5 standing subcommittees focused in areas of design and construction, operations and maintenance, real property and transactional real estate, cyber and physical security, and workforce and organizational performance. One of the things to note about the Federal Facilities Council is directed by our sponsor agencies. They identify the topics that they want the National Academies staff and the sponsor organizations to undertake in a calendar year. The 2020 topics that were selected pre-COVID were practices for facility condition assessments, the varying different practices and their pros and cons, measuring performance versus measuring condition. In addition, other topics was digitization and technology adoption in facilities planning and management, a communications topic around how do we best message the risk of lack of investment in our facilities and actions that can be taken to bring down to improve sustainability and bring down life cycle costs. And lastly, a comparison of facilities cost data, both commercially available and those created within the agencies across the federal government. Other topics that the FFC has undertaken this year, obviously COVID-19 and facilities during and after. So how do we bring people into our facilities? And then what do we think the facilities are going to look like following this pandemic? We do have, it's been a webinar series that we've been running. We have another one coming up around HVAC and ventilation. The supply chain for our skilled facilities workforce, how are agencies currently getting and then envisioning future skilled facilities workforce? How do they obtain them? How are they going to train them? Technology adoption and construction of facility management world, cataloging of agency real property authorities, communicating America's infrastructure investments for better building, energy master planning for resilient public communities, which is actually ongoing right now in a separate forum, managing cybersecurity of operational technology, managing critical infrastructure risks, and O&M planning for scientific facilities and goals. The FFC is organized under the Board on Infrastructure and Constructed Environment at the National Academies, which advises the government and private sector organizations and the general public on questions of technology, science, and public policy, and the relationship between the constructed and natural environment. The BICE vision is to promote research and strategic thinking that inspire society and foster built environments that enhance life quality and sustainable communities. And its members include former Chief of the Army Corps of Engineers, Tom Bostic, Stephen Ayers, former Architect of the Capitol, Dorothy Robine, former GSA Public Building Commissioner, and Jim Rispoli formerly with DOE, as well as other academics and professionals in the built environment world. The communities that the BICE engages with include the federal community, the GAO, the CBO, professional societies such as AIA, American Society of Civil Engineers, and IFMA, professionals including architects, civil engineers, asset and facility managers, capital planners, building system engineers, codes and standards making bodies, and congressional committees and staff. Recent studies from the National Academies Board on Infrastructure include the built environment, which looked at creating a research agenda for understanding better about microbiology and how we operate and build our buildings. A assessing the capital infrastructure needs of the National Institute of Health, which evaluated the infrastructure backlog at the National Institutes of Health and prioritized investments in their main campus in Bethesda, Maryland. As a result of that study, $550 million of extra appropriations has been identified towards NIH in the last several years. And then facility staffing requirements for the Veterans Health Administration, which supported their development of a facility staffing strategy for their VA campuses, for their clinics and all their facilities. Several ongoing studies, one of which you're going to hear about from following speakers, are a strategy for a business case renewal of federal facilities, which is a federal facilities sponsored study, review of project management at DOE's environmental management program, which came out of an NDAA bill. If you follow GAO reports, they've issued many reports over the last several years regarding DOE EM, and the review of methods for setting building and equipment performance standards. It's a peer review of analytical models that are employed by the DOE in setting their standards regulations. Some other past consensus studies are in areas of green building, sustainable critical infrastructure, and high performance buildings. Other impact areas that we have are in infrastructure strategies and practices, budget preparation and policy making, performance and design standards, setting research agendas, workforce, and operations and design decisions on how they affect occupants, users, economics, and in the environment. We've looked at natural and technological hazard impacts, such as extreme winds, fire and earthquake, and mitigation and physical security. And the BICE has worked with the Federal Facilities Council, and Mike and Jack are going to talk about this series of reports later, but we've had a long-standing body of work over 30 years on looking at asset management practices within the federal government. So I want to talk a little bit about the federal facilities asset management in general, and where the FFC has been looking at activity within it. And to start with, that this is a journey. And the benefits, as I showed previously, it's a 30-year journey in FFC and Academies reports. The Transportation Research Board runs a continual research program in transportation system asset management. Other areas in energy, water, telecommunications, and buried infrastructure also have issued reports within the National Academies which address some aspects of asset management. The benefits for enhancing asset management practices can be realized at any time in the life cycle. And unlike many procedures in engineering, construction, and project delivery, asset management does not have a checked, we've done it and you can move on. Rather, it's a continuous process. And the objectives vary by agency and vary over time within an agency. Asset management implementation process recognizes that agencies vary greatly in their need for asset management and their levels of process and technology complexity. Organizations' current capabilities and asset management maturity can be assessed given considerations for people, systems, and process, and specific topics include policy goals and objectives, asset management practices, planning, programming, and project delivery, data management, information systems, transparency and results, and workforce capacity and development. The business case for improved asset management is we can't afford not to do it. Financial basis should be demonstrated in savings across the life cycle, in managed and lessened user disruptions, in optimization of resources, and improved sustainability and improved resilience. The FFC routinely talks about how do we better communicate through our agencies and throughout the stovepipes that exist within those agencies. Implementation of an asset management system considers the roles, needs, and expectations of the stakeholders and how to communicate effectively. Simple guides for effective communication skills focus on simple and connected building blocks like audience identification, message design, message delivery, and effective use of data to drive decisions or market research. Unique factors that will shape our communications include infrastructure conditions, funding levels, authorities related to real property, and political considerations. In looking at a simplified asset management implementation framework, which I showed here, there are several steps. You know, it's what do we have? What do we need to know about what we have and its condition? What's its performance? Investment analysis that provides a defensible basis for operational decisions, communicating those results, and since it's a management system, a process improvement. The following slides document areas that the Federal Facilities Council has explored in each of these areas. In asset management or asset inventory, we've looked at the data management of the FRPP, level of details that are required in your asset inventory, the taxonomies used, and how to measure even square footages. You know, that varies across the federal government. Location, as Keith described, horizontal and both vertical, are still outstanding questions. As-built, BIM, and electronic maintenance manuals, processes for moving those between owners and builders and the operators, plant replacement value and current replacement value. Areas the Federal Facilities Council has involved itself in condition. Actually, 3 of those are in our agendas for 2020, which is methodologies for condition assessments, the pros and cons of those different methodologies, whether they're surveyed, engineered, or other methods for establishing condition, cost estimation for those for deficiencies found in those conditions, and the operations and maintenance required. How do you model that? How do you plan for that? In performance, looking at criticality of the facilities, criticality of systems, mission dependency indexes, and the application of those. Actual costs, how do you know, there was talk about using the budget process to get the actual cost on our facilities, getting a handle on what facilities actually cost the organization. Functionality index, is the facility functioning the way it's intended? Is it providing the need that the organization needs to meet its obligations? Utilization, how is utilization measured? Office utilization is one measurement, but how about other asset classes? Mission impact, and this really boils down to, you know, a basic question of asset management. How does the asset, in this case facility, impact the mission? What is the investment in the asset? How does it affect the mission outcome? Health and safety, user and occupant impact, which NASA has done some interesting work in productivity and health, as well as COVID is a great example of providing a healthy environment to bring people back. Other risks like climate and cyber man-made, enterprise management, and energy management. And then taking investment analysis, looking at maintenance strategies, optimal investment points for repair and renewal, and goals for organizations tied to capital planning. The prioritization methodologies of capital projects. This is the rack and stack. How do you rack and stack projects to meet in the most effective way to meet organizational goals? Communication of results using sustainment management models like Builder, degradation curves, and budget dependent scenarios where if I get X amount of money and I target it to certain assets, what is the outcome of that? What is the outcome to the mission? What are the outcomes in the overall asset condition? And then, you know, in process improvement, evaluating and expanding, you know, do we evaluate or enhance our inventory? Do we add more detail to that? How do we calibrate our asset models? We're going to use them with new data, with better data, developing new asset models if needed, adding new asset classes in that need to be part of our asset programming, including other agency programs, operational programs, not just the facilities program, developing, enhancing data management, mapping, real-time performance, improving our asset management plan, the document itself, the process, adding objective measures based on stakeholder feedback, and evaluating other agency-supported software. DHS talked about the vast number of systems that they've gotten, all the information that's being collected, and using machine learning and other analytical tools to evaluate what can be valuable in the asset management process, in the management of facilities, the real property business processes, which the FRPC is working on, and in technology adoption. Overall, the benefits for improving asset management process are real and measurable and are increasingly recognized by both public and private infrastructure organizations. There's financial savings, ability to manage risk, and enhanced decision support. Ultimately, maturing asset management of federal facilities provides defensible basis for operational decisions, enhancing their ability to compete for resources and funds. Further, those responsible for assets will be able to communicate to executives, budget office, and planning staff the levels of risk and the costs that an agency may be accepting through legacy design and maintenance practices. So that's just a general overview of how the FFC sticks its fingers in all the pieces of this pie. I'd like to turn this over now to Jack Dempsey, who's a director at Definitive Logic and is one of the members of the committee that's writing the report on strategy for renewal of federal facilities.
Thank you, Cameron. And Nick, I guess if you can load up my my 2 slides, that'll be helpful. That's a lot. That's a lot of information. And I go back to a question that was just asked at DHS on, if you got this big picture view of things, like how do you get started? How do you kind of, break it down into pieces? And I think one thing that you've outlined here is both, it is a big picture. It involves a lot of things that are complex. And Nick, you can jump to the next slide as well. But also you got to kind of start somewhere and with a plan in mind and incrementally try to make improvements. I'm Jack Dempsey. Cameron just introduced me, vice chair to the study on to basically develop a strategy to renew federal facilities. I'll be handing over to Mike Aimone here, the chair of the study here momentarily. Go back to, yep, thanks. But what's kind of neat is, all right, so all this stuff has to get done. How do you go about doing it? And that really ends up being kind of the focus of what the study was all about. But as a backdrop, and you've heard some of this before, facility management in the federal sector was really born in 1949. It was after the World War II build out, and now we're starting to figure out how we're going to be managing things. So in 1949, there was a Federal Property and Administration Services Act, which started putting it on the map. A lot of work was done in trying to managing assets, getting things done. But it really wasn't until 1988, which is based on a lot of people taking a look at it, where I think the facility asset management idea really started coming together. And that was a report that was congressionally mandated. And it basically took a look around. So now we got all this infrastructure. How do we maintain it? Think about what's happening here. It's about 40 years after this major build out from World War II. So now things start to get old. And now we're starting to think about how do we not just build things, but how do we maintain things? And that report is pretty significant because it took a step back and started thinking about the meaning and value of these assets and how do we start making those investments. It wasn't long after that report when American Society of Civil Engineers and the report card, and then soon thereafter, GAO, which Keith just talked about in terms of the high risk report, starting to think like, well, let's start managing things and figuring out, are we making good investments and what can we do about doing that better? Along those times in kind of the mid 80s, GIPRA, the Government's Results Performance Act, came on scene. Right before that, the CFO Act. So some of these acts at that point in time, Cunningham was another one in terms of the IT, were really foundational in terms of modernizing the way the government worked, starting to think a little bit more business oriented, but it started pushing and advancing progression of thought process that we talk about in terms of facility asset management today. By extension, the maturing continued, ideas improved, systems and capabilities and the theory behind all that started really coalescing. And it's, we can target 2014, ISO 55000 system of standards was first published, and we've heard a little bit about that. A lot of people on the call know a lot about that. But I think at the time it wasn't like it was just a bright idea from left field that came in and said, hey, let's do this now. It was really in response to a demand in the marketplace. ISO standards serve the needs of improving commerce around the world. So they don't just write standards just to be theoretical. They're really writing standards in response to market demands. And at that time, the idea, and I think what we're seeing here is a progression of thoughts about asset management. It isn't just about coming up with strategies and figuring things out. It's actually let's get systematic in that approach. And a couple of points we've heard is also, asset management really isn't about the asset, it's about the value generated by the assets. So in the continuation of where we are today, recently, OMB's been very active in this area, developing policies, OMB M20 TAC 03 and M20 TAC 10. DHS talked a little bit about how that's impacting their world, is starting to get kind of serious about this investment strategy. And I think now we're starting to look at, it's not just about asset management systems and being able to do the trade-offs, plan versus actual, things like that, having good inventory, having confidence in your data. It's now starting to figure out, how do we apply all that capability and develop strategies? What is our asset management strategies moving forward? So if we go to the next slide real quick. Today, what it's identified here in the slide, won't go into the details, is probably the 4 seminal documents in the federal sector, federal facility asset management, that defines basically the current policies on how you apply asset management. And it's OMB Circular A11, particularly the capital programming guide, which starts talking about investments and decision-making along those lines. Another one, very importantly, and kind of coming on scene with a lot of momentum, is OMB Circular A123. The recent updates on that started focusing on enterprise risk management and management controls. And a lot of what Cameron talked about is really kind of like how to get into that decision-making process, and how do you have confidence and assurance that the decisions you're making are in balance with all the competing needs and interests. And that circular used to be more kind of the CFO's groundwork, but today it's been expressly expanded to include effectively all C-suite activities. And Mr. Burgess, who was talking about things that are going on in DHS, I think is a reflection of these changes that are happening. Most recently, OMB M20 TAC 03, in terms of the implementation of agency-wide real property capital planning, which is complemented by M20 TAC 10, which is really the continuation of the freeze the footprint, reduce the footprint energy. So there is a national strategy that's starting to pull it together, but that document, is recent as it is, and it's not, I think, 6 months old or something like that, is basically saying this is a starting point for really starting to pull that together. So that's the landscape that we're working with, and that was really kind of the run up to this strategy. That's just basically establishing the landscape. I'm going to hand over to Mike Aimone now, who can talk a little bit more about what happened next. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Jack, and to the entire committee. And Eric, a little bit of a time hack. It's about 10 after 2, and we want to preserve some opportunity for questions and answers. I noticed in the chat window, in the Q&A window, there's no specific questions. So I'll put a pitch out. Put your questions out there, folks, so we can answer those thoughts that you might have. Now, Nick, if you'd put my slides up, please. And next slide. So I and Jack led a team of 9 of us, including the 2 of us. The 9 of us were charged through the Federal Facilities Council to look at the subject of renewal of the federal facilities. And to do that, the first thing we did, next slide, please, is the committee in July of 2019 formed. And the first thing we did was we asked the study chairs for these key recent reports to kind of come back and tell us what did they do and what was their journey and how did they get to a set of recommendations. And I'd like to slow down long enough to say that if you were to mention the 1990 study done by the Federal Facilities Council, committing to the cost of ownership, which the theme of this was, wake up the federal government. You own buildings, and owned buildings have responsibilities for maintaining them. You would come, I think, very quickly to the main recommendation of the 1990 study, which was the federal government should spend somewhere between 2 and 4% of their portfolio replacement value in routine maintenance and repair. That doesn't mean major renovation, that's routine maintenance and repair. Spin forward about 8 years. A second committee was formed and looked at something called the stewardship of federal facilities. And in this report, the committee kind of shook the lapels of the facility managers in the federal government and said, you ought to be talking about strategic planning. And if I were to rewrite this slide after we have finished our report, I would have said, as I reread the stewardship report, as we finished up our report, to compare recommendations there to our recommendations in our committee report, was that this is, how do you get the facilities engineering planning documents embedded into the agency's strategic planning processes? And in fact, I will argue also with the 1998 study was the beginnings of thinking about asset management. Spin forward another 6 years or so. I guess it's, 6 years or so. Applying the private sector best practices. This was mid-2000s, 2003, 2004, when the study was being written. And there was a lot of people saying, well, the private sector's got this all figured out. Why aren't you following the best practices in the private sector? And I was involved in this report tangentially because I sat on the Federal Facilities Council as the Air Force Deputy Civil Engineer. And my comment to the study group when they briefed our results to me was, you ought to be looking at not only the best practices in the private sector, but also the best practices in the public sector. The public sector federal, as well as the public sector non-federal, state and local. And then spin forward a fairly large number of years to 2012, and a report I actually got to sit on as a committee member, predicting outcomes. And the intent of this report, at least as we wrote it in 2011 and 2012, was to shake the lapels of the facilities managers and say, your story's wrong. You say, give me a lot of money now, and I will save you a bunch of money in the future. And of course, the budget guys say, hey, that's great, but I don't have the money now. And I won't be around in the future when you say you're promising me to bring me great money back. And so the attempt of this report was to create the analytical basis and the communications structure that would communicate to budget and other senior officials what the outcome would be if you invested in federal facilities. In fact, the idea was we still wanted the large number of front-end dollars, but we needed to sharpen a story how to tell that those investments now will pay later. So now comes the study that Jack and I had the honor to lead, the strategy for applying the business case to renewal. And the first thing we scratched our head on and said, okay, renewal. So this 1990 study was about maintenance and repair. The strategic planning study was a little bit broader, but really did focus on maintenance and repair. The private sector best practices were focused on maintenance and repair, and you're kind of getting where we're going here. We had the chance to, if you will, shape not the maintenance and repair side of the facilities manager's bailiwick, but the capital investment or the renewal. Next slide, if I could. So the committee came up, we had a statement of tasks that was provided to us by the Federal Facilities Council. We stayed pretty close to that, I must admit, but we looked at, we developed a tasking statement that paralleled this and said, look, we're gonna delve a little bit in maintenance, because if you invest in maintenance well, your cost for renewal may be less. But we also expanded renewal to be talking about renewal, maybe not be just take the building and modernize it to national codes and continue to use it, but it may be take that building and gut it down to its columns and beams and repurpose it for a whole different purpose than what it was. But whatever you do, you got to build this from a portfolio point of view. And then second of all, our strategies, and we decided there were more than one strategy for this. Our strategy for articulating not only to the federal facilities managers, but to the budget officials, and frankly, the agency operators. Because the agency operators are the ones that need to understand and articulate to the larger community the needs of the facility to meet mission. So next slide, if I could. Thank you. In our study, the first thing we did was hold a series of public meetings. Those public meetings are of record. There were 3 of them. We had 29 different experts from the federal facilities and budget world, as well as from the from the public non-federal. And by that, I mean we had state governments and government organizations outside the United States talk to us a little bit about what they're doing in this whole subject of capital investments and improvements. But then we also looked at all of the recommendations from the 4 studies we talked to you about. And there were about 55 recommendations across all of them. And we binned them to look at the recommendations, because our thought process is, why not write another report that puts out another 5 to 10 recommendations? Let's go and make sure we look and we understand what's been done on the foundational studies. And I'll let you read this list. And I will tell you that you could do a couple things with this list. By the way, the underlying, you can't read the print, it's too small, is the compiling of all of those other studies that were done and their specific recommendations. And they could be put into or binned into these kind of major issues: linking facilities to mission, using strategic planning principles and incorporating those into the agency strategic planning processes, communications. Our study spent a lot of time looking at strategic communications, asset conditions, and in fact, predicting from asset conditions what future asset capabilities will be. We did not make a recommendation about increased funding, but we did make some recommendations with regards to how the federal government could provide capital funding initiatives. And I'll skip the rest of these for the moment and go to the last slide. I think this may be the last slide. It is the last slide. So it's about 15 minutes left for Q's and A's. What I'd like to do is turn it over. I see from the chat and Q's and A's that I spurred some interest from what were few to many. So Eric, over to you.
Hi, this is Mike Ordinaro, Communications Director for the ALN. Eric Brown had to step away, so I'm going to step in. And we were fortunate to have Bill Brodt from NASA join us. Bill, if you can turn on your camera, that would be great. But before we go on to Bill, I'd just like to say, Mike, you have a way of consistently making the complex simple and understandable. Very much appreciate that. And I look forward to being able to see the full report. So thank you for guiding that complex project. And Jack Dempsey.
Yeah, that was a team effort, and you had a great segue. So where are we in our report? The report's been submitted to the National Academy. It goes through a peer review process, and we're waiting for that peer review process. Over to you, Mike.
When it comes out, we'd love to have a full session on that. And Jack, your listing of what has been happening recently actually gives me hope that people in the federal government are listening to the global approach to systematic thinking towards managing asset. So thanks for that. And Cameron, the value to the nation that you're providing is significant. Thank you for sharing everything you're doing there. So now we need to give Bill Brodt a little bit of equal time to explain some things about NASA, but also give us insight on what NASA is looking at in terms of asset management. It's actually quite exciting. Bill?
Thank you. I happen to, Jack's slide of showing the progression of things, I go back to about 1988 with the Federal Facilities Council, and I can say that NASA pays a lot of attention to the reports coming out of the Federal Facilities Council and the parent organization, the BICE. Much of the work in building information modeling came out of the Federal Facilities Council, and many of the people that have been involved in asset leadership kind of transitioned from building modeling, which was not just a 3D modeling, but recognizing that all of the information over the entire life cycle was what building information modeling was all about. Now, take this to NASA. NASA was involved in ISO 9000 very deeply long before I came to NASA, but I was in the federal government, and NASA really adopted it, and our entire governance structure, we call them NASA procedural requirements, was based on the ISO 9000 work. We dropped ISO 9000 as a requirement, but that vestige is with us. We are active with an environmental with ISO 50000, and I have been tracking the work with 55,000 and APA 1000. I can say that in general, we follow the principles, but if you look at our history, I thought in 1958 that NASA was a brand new organization. After I came to NASA, I found out that wasn't the case. It was mostly cobbled together from military facilities with a few new places. And the histories of each of the organizations is embedded in our culture yet today. So getting a one NASA view has been a struggle since 1958 and is continuing. We are presently undergoing a major reorganization. I mean a real reorganization, not just change the titles. And it will do a great deal to bring that one NASA about, which has an impact, a good impact on portfolio management. Because traditionally it was each center circling its wagons and wanting to get its fair share. And anytime you deviated from the fair share, there were many repercussions from the headquarters facilities people were in an awkward position. We didn't control everything. Regarding our work right now, the slides mentioning reduce the footprint are very interesting. I was engaged in setting up that initial reduce the footprint emphasis on offices and warehouses. Honestly, I did it because I didn't want anybody looking at our other facilities, which is where our real money was. And I was successful in that. But unfortunately, I think the government spent too much attention on counting square feet. Once we got rid of our vacant facilities, and we had a lot of them, it gets very difficult to consolidate because it means people have to be moved. You have to have money to renovate facilities. There's just many complex decisions. We are in a very good position right now because every one of our NASA centers that has submitted a new master plan has achieved our target, which is a very aggressive target for reducing our portfolio site by site. But we are now establishing an agency-wide master plan. So every master plan will have to conform to the agency mission, strategic plan, and the funding limitations, because that's been a real problem. You can have a master plan, great vision, but do you have any chance of getting the money you need to achieve it? I think now, in the last couple of years, we're seeing master plans that are much more in line with an achievable budget. We fight the scientists and engineers who want to throw things into space. We rarely get beyond that, but if we do get beyond it, we'll get cut out by OMB. And if we get beyond that and get up to Congress, we're fighting other committees, our appropriation is part of a larger pie, and we have to fight with our share of that. So it's not an easy posture, but we're aiming at a very substantial reduction. Now, one way to get that in portfolio management that we have an advantage of, we can rent out our facilities and retain the income. It doesn't go back to the Treasury. Now, there's ins and outs of what can and cannot be done, but the general principle is we are renting out our facilities at a phenomenal rate over the last few years. You see these SpaceX and Boeing throwing stuff into space from our launch sites. They're paying for that. And they are building things, and they are using facilities that we no longer need. But we don't have any way to record that in our reduce the footprint. So the innovative approaches to facility management that are sometimes available to the government, our common simple metric isn't picking up. I guess bottom line is we are in principle following the ISO 55000 concepts. I don't think we've reached a point that we're ready to go forward with the additional steps that would be needed to become certified. But we're doing some very attractive, exciting things. You see them, I see them when we launch something, but out on the ground, there's some very good work going on too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. And I just want to let everybody know that this is such a dynamic panel that we will have a official end at the half hour. But for those who can stick around, please continue because we will continue the discussion. And I want to start, Bill, by asking you if you could share something that you shared with me while we were preparing for this about the fact that other organizations, other NASA asset categories are also looking at ISO 55000. And is this some way that you're helping to break down barriers between the different asset groupings at NASA?
Well, as part of the transformation, there's some barriers that have been broken down. Like I have sat across the hallway from the Chief Information Officer's staff for several years. I never talked to them. But now we've established hackathons and digital transformation activities, and we are now engaged with people at our centers, myself and a few others at headquarters, with the Chief Information Officer, looking at strategies which will have an impact, a big impact, I think, on our facility operations. That just didn't occur before. We were a pyramid structure, and it was difficult to cross those lines. We have another project going on right now that JPL brought to the table, and I got it going. We're looking at our building information modeling and looking at object model attributes, the information that we would like to have for life cycle facility management. This translates, of course, into cost of operation, because if you have the right information at the right time, you can reduce the costs. I've been aiming at this for 30 years. The work started at the Federal Facilities Council in 1990. It was the subject of 2 major events. It was carried to the National Institute of Building Sciences, and actually a lot of money was spent on it from many agencies contributed. But it's now, 30 years later, some of the aspects of it still aren't implemented. It was a bridge too far. We got partway. Now we're going in and trying to cross the rest of the bridge. These are
Excellent.
exciting things.
Yes, that's very exciting. And Nick, will you come in and show the slide of our member organizations? And for those people who have to leave, we thank you for joining us. And for those who stick around, we're going to start with a comment from Vince Carter from DHS, who joined us recently. So those were the organizational members. We thank them because without them, we would not be able to do this. And this is very exciting. So Mr. Carter, if you can, would you like to make some statements about what you've heard and what you're doing at Department of Homeland Security?
Mike, I'm pinging him and maybe he's away from his desk.
Okay. So I will got that one instead to Jack Dempsey. Jack, can you make some comments about activities at Department of Homeland Security, publicly available information?
Well, I think Department of Homeland Security kind of spoke well for themselves. What I found really interesting is they're almost kind of like adult age now. They've been around. I think Mr. Burgess kind of made a point. They're the youngest department. And it's interesting, you know, having been a former member of the Department of Homeland Security, kind of exciting to see how they're progressing. So I think it's really exciting to just see what they're doing. And I think what they're doing is also echoing in lots of other places. You know, Bill's points on NASA are similar in terms of, I think there's a curiosity out there. There's obviously a lot of need to figure out how to kind of pull this together. And there's a lot of solutions that are evolving and developing. I think in terms of Asset Leadership Network and what you're doing, there's a convergence here. Obviously, this group is oriented towards asset management and the broader promise of what asset management and disciplined asset management provides in terms of, you know, standards-based approach and other things. So I think from just a private tax-paying citizen, it's exciting to see the federal government thinking seriously about this and looking to make things better. So I think that's probably a good summation of what I heard and saw at the panel today.
Excellent. David Pakuar, are you still available?
Yes, I am.
So can you comment on what you've heard that's developing and how that might be helpful?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would echo really what I'm hearing kind of across the board. We're all looking to make progress and to, you know, have a system make that incremental improvements. I think some of the challenges that were pointed out there about, you know, metrics, and a lot of the metrics, for instance, reduce the footprint. And it's easy to default to, you know, what's the number, but so often there's so many things that are very nuanced, especially when you have portfolios that are largely, you know, diverse and not all office space. Data quality is something that I've heard kind of reoccurring across the board. You know, overall, you know, I think we're all working and moving in that direction to make progress, but it's going to take time. I definitely think, and I know that we've done that internally within DHS, is to leverage those best practices. GAO made recommendations around the structure. We've got the ISO 55 as a framework, and, you know, leveraging that. The last thing that I'll note is what OMB puts out. Really, you know, that's really our action items. Those are kind of our taskers when we get directives from OMB to, you know, work on that. That's really what pushes the button, and that's what really moved us forward within DHS. So hopefully, you know, as a federal community, we can all make progress moving forward.
Excellent. In terms of the federal community, Cameron, if you're available, there is a question that is about international best practices. And I wonder if you're looking at other countries or other sources for some of the insights that you're getting.
The Federal Facilities Council itself Because everything is tied so closely to the budget process and to guidelines and policies that are issued by the federal government, it hasn't really looked at internationally what other countries are doing. I do think in some of our studies, and in the case of the renewal study and past studies, we do look at what European countries are doing. I know Australia and Great Britain and a few other countries have very robust asset management programs of their public infrastructure. One of the differences between the country, a lot of it is about who owns the infrastructure, whether it's public infrastructure or private infrastructure or some sort of pseudo public-private infrastructure ownership in there. And I think a lot of the asset management policies and processes from a public standpoint are about that ownership level. Jack I know because of Jack's involvement with some international standards development, may have a better valuation or description of that.
Yeah, Jack, can you comment?
So yeah, in the capacity, I'm involved with ISO 55000, full disclosure, in a leadership position, and I convene the product improvement work group there. So we look at across the world, kind of what's going on in the area of asset management. It's not exclusively physical infrastructure, but right now there's probably more energy in the physical infrastructure aspects in terms of that. And I think Cameron kind of made a good point. Asset management is a lot about the value generated by the asset. So the organizations or the stakeholders, whether they're ratepayers in terms of they need water, you need a good working transportation system that you're dependent on. And assets involve things beyond that. There's IT assets, there's brand reputation, like, hey, when I buy a certain quality of product, I expect it to be good. That's an asset, in terms of the trust. So assets go a lot of different places, but it gets down to what does that stakeholder value? If it has a lot to do with resiliency and energy initiatives such as reduce the footprint, reduce the carbon footprint, and that's valuable to the organization, that becomes part of that thought process. If it is more about, resiliency in terms of being able to respond under a whole range of different circumstances, and DHS is a good example of that as a responding organization, they have to, think about these things when they're formulating their asset management program. So the asset management standards, ISO 55000 standards, is a management system. It's not a how to manage your assets better. It's basically, here's a series of good management practices that have been distilled down from all around the world in terms of a systematic approach of how to manage assets. So that's kind of like the ground rules. Now on top of that, and I think, Mike talked about it in terms of the study that we just completed, and it's still not published, but it's heading out the door, is, strategies to renew federal facilities really revolves around the definition of two words in that. Renew, which is more than just do maintenance and repair. It's, keep things moving and think about it on a portfolio level. And we found out there isn't just a single strategy. There's strategies. There's strategies on how you manage your assets. There's actually strategies on the value of how your assets, generate. And I think, the more personally I learn about asset management, the more I understand there's some basic elements to it. And the more you learn that, I think I personally found the more helpful it is to, or easier it is to apply, but more helpful it is to the end user, the stakeholders. Are you getting a bigger ROI out of it, basically?
So that leads to a couple of questions that I'm going to combine that focus on measurement. We've been talking about the big picture, but what are the actual specific measurements for individuals, for organizations, even energy savings, or what kind of measurements are good to look at for realizing the value? I'm sure it's different for each situation, but Jack, if you can address that in general, maybe David could say what some of the measurements are that the Department of Security is looking at.
Well, I'll give it like the initial point is, I mean, there's some obvious ones. Condition. I think Mike was talking about it, or maybe DHS talking about like functionality. You know, there's different kind of performance metrics of, you know, what are your specifications. Resiliency. GAO has a number of reports that came out. I mean, Keith, I think talked a little bit about it, but Amelia, who was another speaker at different formats, talked more at length about resiliency and what that means. So measures are many, stakeholders are many, and their interests are varied and complex. So there's lots of measures, but ultimately it gets down to, you know, almost kind of like a willing buyer, willing seller premise. The kind of the economics is, if condition is really important to you, then you're going to spend money on it. And I think things like the American Society of Civil Engineering report card, or the fact that, you know, we're managing things at a condition index that is too low or not, or lower, that's in an uncomfortable way. I think the engineer probably thinks about it that way, but honestly, if the end consumer really values the condition goes up. And I think, example, a lot of federal public spaces, if it's public facing and it serves a purpose in terms of functionality, bringing people together, you're going to find the spaces there probably maintained better. Whereas, you know, the warehouse where you're parking the old, lawnmowers, not going to be managed in that way. So I think there's kind of like an economy there. And I think that's representative of what asset management is really, really about. So it's probably too complex a topic to cover in one specific area, but the stakeholders will tell you what's important. And if you can find ways to describe the criteria in terms of a scale, you have a performance metric.
David?
Sure. Let me just add on. So absolutely, we can echo everything that Jack's saying here. We worked a lot with Jack. So on the DHS side, so what we've focused on were metrics that we can get the data for. So obviously there's a lot of different metrics that you could apply over here. We're primarily focusing on the condition index, no surprise there. Recapitalization rate is another metric that we use, utilization rate, operating cost per square foot, and we also are looking at, you know, asset maturity, which essentially looks, asset management maturity, which primarily focuses on the dollars that could be found in the budget that are tied directly to the asset management plans for the real property capital plans that we put together. So there's multiple metrics. We're trying to work primarily off of data sets that already exist, which are founded on the FRPP. But yeah, it's having there's not one KPI out there, obviously, that is going to answer all the questions.
So, Bill, there was a comment about many organizations that are being certified to ISO 55001 for their personal property. Can you address how your NASA facilities are working with your personal property and IT property? Are there ways you're helping each other?
Honestly, that's one that I can't say much about, except that for years I was trying to get the reporting capability to identify personal property assets that were associated with a real property asset. It took 5 years before we could get the personal property and IT people to use the real property asset number. Now we have that, and I've been engaging in discussions with our master planners and real property and personal property people about looking at the total value of the asset we're protecting, which is not just the replacement value of the real property asset, but it includes the people, which is the dominant cost, and the personal property. So we have $12 billion worth of personal property, and it has been completely ignored in our real property capital planning decisions. I think it's getting into the equation now as a component of total cost of ownership. We have been looking at the O&M costs pretty well, but and we have a great record in terms of safety of our employees. That's a big deal in our culture, and believe me, I am confident regarding COVID that they're not going to ask anybody to come back to work unless they can provide the best possible safe conditions. That's a big plus for us. But getting these other factors in is just now getting into our culture.
Well, thank you, Bill, for all your years of work on that topic. It's admirable that you spent 5 years getting that to happen. And Jim Dieter, CEO of the ALN, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to raise my hand with that same sort of question, Mike. So Jack Kelly had mentioned the personal property topic, but I worked, Bill, I don't think I knew you then, but doing NASA support work around Goddard Space Flight Center from the early 90s into the early 2000s. You know, both from a contractor perspective and managing, providing people to help with the management of government assets on, on the facilities. And it was always frustrating from the personal property management perspective of trying to get all these pieces together. One NASA contractor that I worked for at one time was working on 3 separate asset management systems, both methodologies and software. One for company-owned capital, one for government property, and one for IT assets. And they looked at me like I was crazy when I said, so we should have one system that covers all of this stuff. And I think, we're on the path now where those kind of important questions can be answered. I was just to summarize it, when I got some attention in that direction, I would say things like, so if the building burned down, how would you know what was in it? So glad to hear that you're making progress on identifying the assets to the buildings. That's awesome.
And Jim, would you like to make any summary comments before we conclude?
Oh, this is great. I've had the good fortune to do some work personally myself, again, as I said, with NASA and with Homeland Security. Has been, so it's very interesting to work with those organizations. I can say that I know that the personal property procedures at DHS, I haven't seen them recently, but I helped write them at one point, and they were based on ISO 55000 concepts before the document had been published. So they might not have too much distance to cover there to include those. But I particularly want to take this time to thank Cameron and representing our association with the National Academies has been remarkable and highly beneficial to the mission of our organization. And, I see it making an impact to the mission of the National Academies, which is greatly gratifying, and to the efforts of Mike Aimone and Jack Dempsey and others in that direction. So very much thanks to them, and thanks for everybody that all the panelists today and for the participants. So I think we have some very useful information here that we can all go back and look at as as we share these videos and various pieces of the videos online. So thanks, Mike. And good job by you too, Mike. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. And thank you to the Department of Homeland Security that gave such a comprehensive view of their asset management approach for real property. It's very helpful, and we hope other agencies are able to benefit from that. And Bill, thanks again for your efforts at NASA, and we look forward to hearing from you as the progress is made at unifying an approach to all asset management there.
Thank you.
All right.
I forgot to say thanks to Nick. Nick has been a great addition to have Nick, really enabling, our speedy and I wouldn't say seamless, but very expeditious transition from a real in-person, real-time event to a real-time online event. So thanks, Nick.
It's been my pleasure to be a part of it.
Well, thanks, everybody. And thank you to all of you who've stuck around for this. We appreciate your attention and your time. Bye for now.